Conflicts and disasters are pushing a record number of people out of their homes to seek shelter from war and destruction. The Internal Displacement Monitoring Center says more than 75 million were forced to flee within their own country in 2023. The worst affected nation is Sudan, where civil war has displaced more than 9 million people. Many have also left Sudan for neighboring Chad. A warning, our next report contains some disturbing images.
4-year-old Yasmin has struggled to walk since she was shot in the leg. She is from Al Janina in Sudan's West Darfur, but is growing up in a camp for displaced people across the border in Chad. Last year, as fighting neared their home, Yasmin fled with her family. But the rebel paramilitary group, the Rapid Support Forces, caught up with them. A bullet tore through Yasmin's leg and hit her mother.
Her mother, who was 8 months pregnant, was killed, and Yasmin was left all alone. Some people found her on the road and brought her here. On the road to the border, we all suffered. The Rapid Support Forces killed and wounded so many people.
A recent Human Rights Watch report accuses the Rapid Support Forces and allied militias of carrying out attacks in West Darfur, killing thousands. The report says this indicates ethnic cleansing, war crimes and genocide. The paramilitary group has been at war with Sudan's army since April 2023. And Darfur is a front in the civil war. Dozens of people were killed in clashes and airstrikes in Elbashir over the weekend. It's the last major city in Darfur still under the Sudanese army's control. The city is reportedly under siege and there is a communications blackout. The United Nations warns that fighting is endangering 800,000 civilians in Elbashir and preventing aid from reaching the region, where millions of people are on the brink of famine.
That time is running out to prevent starvation in Darfur, as intensifying clashes in North Darfur's capital, Elbashir, are hindering our efforts to deliver vital food assistance into the region.
The UN has called the situation in Sudan one of the worst humanitarian disasters in recent memory. Aid groups fear that the violence in Darfur could lead to another massacre and force millions more people to flee for their lives.
Elbashir Idris is an analyst and researcher on Sudan and joins us from the UK. Elbashir, welcome to DW. You have been mapping and documenting human rights violations in Sudan. What can you tell us about the scale of the atrocities being carried out?
Well, thanks to an internet blackout since mid-February, the atrocities and the crimes that have been reported are severely underreported. It's become very difficult to be able to ascertain and verify a lot of these catastrophes that we've been hearing about. Any information that comes out of Sudan, as said, it's a drop in the bucket compared to all the atrocities that would be happening. And now with the RSF essentially sieging the city of Elbashir, and essentially they've begun the siege after a few days of, or rather a few weeks of very heavy warnings from international organizations and communities. It's very imperative that this siege oncoming to the city of Elbashir, with a population of over 800,000 people and estimates of over 110,000 people in terms of casualties, which is more than Hiroshima and Nagasaki. There needs to be much more heavy-handed approaches to make sure that this siege and conflict doesn't go forward.
Mm-hmm. We'll look at how to put an end to this, but first I want to look back in history. Are we back to the same situation we were seeing 20 years ago with the same actors involved?
Well, essentially, we're seeing the same tactics and strategies being used. That's for certain. Now, the history in terms of the Rapid Support Forces, as you say, they are the same that have committed the atrocities 20 years ago with ethnic cleansings and genocide against those of African descent or those they consider to be more African. there has been many reports, especially from the Yale Humanitarian Lab, is showing and documenting through satellite imagery in terms of scorched earth tactics and the razing of villages down to the ground, along with eyewitness and source reports that show that tell these stories. However, it's thanks to technology that we get to see the same things that are happening now, the very same exact that happened 20 years ago. And as such, this is a failure on many different parts. However, there is an opportunity now to cut this short without having to continue on this mayhem.
How can this be cut short? How can Sudan find a way out of this spiral of violence? There have been regional efforts to end the fighting. Why have they not been successful?
Well, essentially, the paradigms of this conflict isn't your typical West or East or North and South. Sudan is essentially going through many people may say a counter-revolution. Others may say this war is a resource grab opportunity, and both would be correct. However, because there's so many different external players involved, from Egypt to UAE to Russia, as well, it's not that easy to suddenly cut this conflict short. However, what should be done is the international players should really have a heavier hand onto its allies and friends who have a hand in the Sudan war, to tell them to stop arming, to stop funding the belligerents, as it's causing more harm and damage than it is any returns that this war will offer. Sudan's median age is, before the war, was 17. Seeing the most of the fighters being that of the young people, what is the median age going to be after this war? Will it be less, or will it even be more, because there won't be enough young people around? And as such, this is what we're seeing. We're seeing a whole killing off, a sacrificing of a generation in real time. And it's imperative that for Sudan and the world to go forward together, there needs to be a heavier hand onto those allies who are funding and arming the belligerents.
Yeah. Internationally, the war in Sudan is often called a forgotten war. How dangerous is the lack of attention for the people in the country and for those who want to see an end to the bloodshed?
Well, some may say a forgotten war. I personally call it an ignored war, and it's a selectively ignored war. There is information that does come out. There has been numerous atrocities that have been reported, yet people have turned a blind eye to it. And the reason why they may have turned a blind eye, there's many different factors within that. May it be racism, may it be an opportunity, if it's better off if Sudan was not in the limelight in this case. However, in this instance, the best way forward would to be to put more eyes on Sudan, to keep focus and eyes on Sudan. The reason why we're not getting as much information, as said, was due to a telecoms blackout that has been with many different reports stating that it was the RSF that committed this attack. And it's very important that there is internet. Why? So we can document these abuses, so we can send money and aid to those who are desperately in need, and to be able to communicate with those on the ground who really do need that help. And there has been many different initiatives and ways of doing that, one of them being Starlink, in fact. But even Starlink is being threatened in Sudan in closing down due to it being a parallel market compared to the usual markets that Starlink would find itself in. Yeah. As such, the Sudanese on the ground and elsewhere have taken very extreme and desperate measures to make sure they can mitigate and help mitigate the catastrophe we're seeing in Sudan.
Yeah. And you are trying to keep eyes on Sudan. It's a very important work you're doing. That was researcher Elbashir. Idris, great speaking to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
We can now bring in Toby Harward. He's the UN's Deputy Humanitarian Coordinator for Sudan and joins us from Nairobi in Kenya. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us today. Now, we heard of 4-year-old Jasmine and her family being targeted by rebels there. Tell us more about who the Rapid Support Forces are targeting and why.
Well, I mean, it's very clear since the war broke out in Sudan in April of last year, there have been significant numbers of civilians who have been targeted, both directly and indirectly, as a result of the conflict between the two armies, the Sudanese Armed Forces and the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces. In El Geneina, in particular, there is a long-standing ethnic conflict between many of the Arab communities and the Masalit and other non-Arab communities over land, resources, diminishing resources, in fact, due to climate change and extended droughts. So it's a historical grievance, historical problems between two sides. But certainly what's happened in recent years with the arming of the Rapid Support Forces and their Arab militias, they have significantly more firepower, and they have been able, both in 2003 conflict and most recently now, to remove, fight pitched battles against the African communities, and also which has led to the wide scale, as Human Rights Watch is calling it, ethnic cleansing of the Masalit from El Geneina. And as you have said, 300,000 people or more, I think it's actually about 500,000 people, fled as a result of the conflict between July and November of last year.
Yeah. And more than 9 million people are estimated to have been internally displaced by the conflict. With the fighting spreading, though, is there any place that is still safe within Sudan?
Yes, there are safe places. Sudan is an extremely big country. It's the size of Western Europe. Most of it. There are safe places up in the north of the country, up in the east of the country. But obviously, the key population zones, first and foremost, Khartoum and the Tri-City area, many of the cities in the Kordofans and the center of the country have been affected by fighting, and Darfur very much so. Your reporter talked about the fighting in Elbashir that has flared up over the last several days. That is of extreme concern to the United Nations. The Secretary General spoke about it in his in a press statement today. It is extreme concern. There is well over 1 million people who are trapped there in a city. It is being besieged by the Rapid Support Forces. It is being subject to artillery attacks from the Rapid Support Forces. They are Sudanese Armed Forces air bombardments in parts of the city. 2 days ago, some NASA infrared images spoke of, we saw burning in approximately 1/3 of the city. Mass displacement within the city, people trying to move to so-called safer areas. But tens of people have been killed, and we really do fear for an escalation in Elbashir. If the parties do not de-escalate, and do not think before they jump off the abyss, the fighting in Elbashir can well exacerbate and metastasize the conflict in Darfur, and we could end up seeing a repetition of what we have seen in El Geneina, and as reported as such by Human Rights Watch.
Yeah, and I want to talk about your work briefly. In November of last year, the Sudanese government ordered the UN to end its mission in Sudan. What has that meant for the humanitarian situation, and how are people getting the aid they need?
Well, the Security Council closed down the political mission, UNITAMS. The humanitarian mission has not been affected by that. We continue to try to get as much aid into the country as possible. Of course, we were very badly affected by looting, stealing systematically in the early months of the conflict, primarily by the Rapid Support Forces. And we have been trying to sort of build up our aid capacities in key havens, both inside the country and in Chad. And we have been seeking to get as much aid into the country as possible. And we have had some support from both sides. However, I would say that, continuing bureaucratic impediments, concerns over allowing the United Nations to access Darfur from Chad by the government has significantly led to a reduction in the capacity that we wish to provide if we had better access and better support from the parties.
Yeah, understandably so. That was Toby Harward, UN Deputy Humanitarian Coordinator for Sudan. Thank you so much for your insights.
Thank you for your time.
Well, for more on the situation in Sudan, we're joined now by Abiol Lual Deng, an analyst who studies the region. She's currently here in Germany. Thanks for being with us. Abiol, millions of people have been displaced in Sudan just in the past year. Do you see any prospect for those people returning to their homes safely?
Thank you for having me on, Terry. I think at the current moment, it's impossible for most of the displaced civilians to it's simply not possible, particularly for the ethnicities that have been targeted. You know, per the Human Rights Watch report, we know that the Masalit and other non-Arab identifying groups are specifically undergoing what has been declared by many people to be an ethnic cleansing and genocide. So will they be able to return to their homes safely? At the current moment, no, because if anything, the conflict is intensifying as the two sides try to gain control of Al-Fashar, the last part of Darfur that isn't under RSF control.
I wanted to ask you about that because the Darfur region has experienced horrible violence. Many fear there could be another massacre coming in the regional capital, Elbashir. As we mentioned that in our report, that it seems to be under siege. How concerned are you about a potential massacre there?
Well, I think that it's clear that many civilians, will be killed because so far we've seen that both sides have been, bombing heavily populated areas, that there's been violence in heavy populated areas, that the attacks happen not necessarily against specific, military targets. MSF recently condemned, I think on May 11th, and bombing by actually the SAF that occurred very close to medical facilities, and I believe even impacted some of the few medical facilities that are still operating. And then we also know, because of the media blackout, we know that the RSF has also been accused of heinous crimes in West Darfur and throughout Darfur. So the reality is that there is most likely severe human rights crimes taking place right now in the Al-Fashir region.
What prospect is there for an intervention to stop this from getting worse? Is there any intervention by the international community that would be feasible in this situation, do you think?
I think it's really difficult because it's easy to see Sudan as an isolated kind of civil conflict. But in reality, many people, including Chatham House and others, have rightly described this as proxy war. And so we're now seeing that Sudan is also becoming the terrain for a lot of intermediary fights going on. And that includes actors that are as far afield as Ukraine and Russia, China. We also see a lot of the fight for dominance in the Gulf region occurring in Sudan. So even if you put an arms embargo on Sudan, is that going to stop arms from coming? We know stories that certain parties, for example, the RSF, have been armed by actors in the Gulf via Chad or via other areas. So I don't really know what can happen.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. Abiol, thank you very much for talking with us. That was Abiol Lual Deng, an analyst of the Sahel region, and has joined us here from Germany. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
For more about this situation, I'm now pleased to welcome Hamid Khalafallah, a Sudan policy analyst. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. Last year, millions of people in Sudan were forced to move from their homes. Can you tell us a little bit more about the circumstances that they are fleeing from?
Absolutely. So people have left their homes and the places where they belong and so on in seek of safe havens internally and externally. Internally, people are being pushed to go into new areas that do not have the capacity to provide services in terms of health, education, electricity, food, and so on. And those who have crossed the borders are facing also very difficult circumstances where there is no support being provided. They have lost their income and so on. But the vast majority is still inside the country and facing, disastrous situation, a looming famine coming very soon, and people are just hungry. They're eating leaves and grass.
Now, have there been international efforts to both end the fighting in Sudan and to provide enough aid? I mean, it seems like they clearly have not been successful. Can you tell us why you think this has fallen apart?
The international community is definitely lagging in terms of the response to Sudan. On the political side, there haven't been enough interest and enough determination to push warring factions to put an end to the fighting. Meanwhile, this is very much possible. Both warring factions have regional allies and are being, they have sustained their fighting up to date more than a year since the war erupted because of these regional and transnational links. So by cutting these ties, the international community could very much end the war, and by getting more serious about approaching this. In terms of the humanitarian side, there are many issues. The Sudan humanitarian response plan is largely underfunded. There is no enough funds being channeled to Sudan, but even what is being channeled to Sudan is not being used efficiently by using local responders who have been on the ground for more than a year, responding with whatever little means that they have. And these funds get lost in the bureaucracy of international aid agencies.
Is it possible to say a little bit more about what is happening in Elbashir? We heard in this report just now that there is a communications blackout and it's been difficult to communicate. But have you heard anything in terms of how things are developing?
What's happening in Elbashir is horrific, and it's absolutely, frightening that it's happening just a few days after Human Rights Watch released their report on what happened in West Darfur in El Geneina last year, and the genocide and the ethnic cleansing that took place there. And this would only be, a snapshot of what could happen in Elbashir, the capital of North Darfur. So it's absolutely frightening. And this is a city of 800,000, residents who are mostly IDPs themselves or refugees, because Elbashir is comprised of many big refugees camps, and we have been seeing over the past few days reports coming out of these IDPs camps where people have been attacked, people have been injured, and there are no services. There is, presence of MSF, Doctors Without Borders, in some of the camps, but one of the camps that hosts the vast majority of people has only one doctor. So it is a very frightening situation.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on DW News to tell us about it. That is Sudan policy analyst Hamid Khalafallah. We very much appreciate your time today.